have some kind of geographic location service offered through an application, and most of those applications on a voluntary basis at the present time are requiring opt-in before geographic location information can be collected. You commonly will see that opt-in bar pop up on your cell phone whenever you enter a new area. And it basically says, do you want for your exact geographic location to be utilized by this service? I always click yes because the service that's provided is oftentimes very useful, but at least it is an opt-in that the individual has an opportunity to really think about before deciding to allow that information to be collected. And that would probably be an aspect of any legislation that moves forward. Information about children would be another example of sensitive information for which it's almost certain that opt-in would be required. The other broad area in which opt-in would probably be a fundamental aspect of these bills would be the sharing of information beyond the website that collects it with unaffiliated third parties. For example, if a website collects information and just sells that information to anyone who wants to pay for it, that would be a sharing with an unaffiliated third party. Opt-in would be required for that. The more common situation in which that kind of sharing occurs is in the context of an advertising network, where a variety of websites cooperate together in the collection of information about website visitors, and then share that information across the range of websites that are a part of the advertising network. And then when an individual visits a given website, information collected by another website in that network could well be used for the targeted advertising of that internet visitor. That's a practice that, while increasingly common today, raises concerns among internet privacy advocates and would be a subject of significant debate during the course of any legislation. In the bill that we put forward last year, for example, we would only allow the sharing of information among unaffiliated sites subject to opt-in, but we subjected that provision to some significant exceptions. And I'll just take a moment to describe these, because you've already seen one measure introduced, I think, by Bobby Rush this year, member of the House Commerce Committee, that incorporates the exact approach we had recommended last year. And that is a broad exception to opt-in for the sharing among these advertising networks, where within the network you find two features. First of all, a single icon that can be clicked on that would allow an opt-out of information sharing within the entire advertising network. And secondly, the opportunity for the internet user to view the preference profile that has been collected about him and to modify that profile. So you could actually see the list of preferences that has been assembled by that advertising network, and you would have an opportunity to modify those preferences if you didn't like the particular coding that had been applied to you. And where you have those two, at the present time still relatively uncommon, higher levels of internet privacy afforded by the advertising network, we would allow that network to operate under the opt-out principle. So it's essentially a carrot that's held out. If you do these additional things, you can then within your network use opt-out as the operating principle instead of the general rule of opt-in. There are other things that I think will be elements of any successful internet privacy bill. There would, in all likelihood, be a preemption of inconsistent privacy guarantees by the states. If we're going to have a national system, the argument is let's make it truly national, and it's very difficult for internet-based companies to comply with a diverse and often conflicting set of guarantees that are offered state by state. And so the goal would be to have a significant set of federal privacy assurances and then let that be the national law on the subject with nothing further permitted in the states. There, in all likelihood, will be a provision that says that there can be no private cause of action for violations of the privacy provisions that are provided by the statute. That will be controversial. The consumer community very much would like to see private causes of action. The internet advertisers are strongly opposed to private causes of action. My guess is the legislation winds up with no private cause of action. That's certainly the way we had structured our bill last year. And I think it makes sense, because in return for no private cause of action, you have at the Federal Trade Commission strong federal enforcement and civil penalty authority, so that individual violations can be taken to the FTC for action. And the FTC has a long and successful track record of acting on a case-by-case basis to protect consumer rights. It's probably the best agency around in terms of doing that. And so we would simply extend that authority and rely on that good experience at the FTC to enforce privacy rights as well. It is very possible that state attorneys general would be given the authority to enforce these rights also, and possibly a state agency would also have the opportunity to enforce these rights. But there would be no opportunity for individuals to take the cause into the regular civil courts and litigate against the internet company there. In all likelihood, any successful privacy measure will have a broad exemption for areas in which there are currently existing more specific privacy guarantees provided. So, for example, today we have a very specific set of privacy guarantees in the health-related field. That's under HIPAA. We have a very precise set of specific privacy guarantees for financial services that's contained under Graham-Leach-Bliley. And the goal of general privacy legislation for internet users is not to supersede in any way these carefully drafted, more specific privacy assurances extended sector by sector, but to provide for the vast majority of internet users in other experiences a set of privacy rights. So it's essentially a gap-filling proposal, but there's a big gap that needs to be filled. Exempt other more specific privacy guarantees. The Federal Trade Commission would have broad rulemaking authority to enforce the provisions of the law, and as I mentioned, enforcement and civil penalty authority with regard to violations. I think this privacy debate will emerge early. You're already seeing legislation introduced, at least in the House, and it is now teed up for action in the course of this Congress. There's a significant prospect that it will be acted on successfully and result in a privacy law being adopted. The second area in which I would anticipate that Congress will certainly debate legislation and in all likelihood pass a bill this year is the effort to free up more spectrum for commercial wireless services. And the need for that spectrum is truly urgent. Today, we are seeing order of magnitude increases in the volume of data services each year. Even with the launch later this year of LTE, the fourth generation of commercial mobile wireless services, and that will be in the 700 megahertz block that was recently vacated by the broadcasters in association with the digital television transition. By about the middle of this decade, I think we're going to see the crunch come. And so we've got 5 years to identify additional spectrum that can be made available for wireless services and through any of various devices, put that spectrum on the market for commercial users to occupy. Realizing that we have this urgent need, last June the President issued a directive that the FCC and the NTIA work together and identify 500 megahertz of spectrum now in the hands of other users, whether that be government users or private spectrum holders, that could be repurposed for commercial wireless services. Our communications subcommittee approved on a bipartisan basis legislation that I drafted in partnership with Cliff Stearns, the ranking Republican member of the subcommittee at the time. And we obtained, as I recall, the bipartisan co-sponsorship of, I think, all of the members of the subcommittee for this. And it would give to the Federal Communications Commission what we call incentive auction authority. And this would be the authority to hold out to the private holders of spectrum the opportunity to surrender all or portions of the spectrum they hold for public auction, with the spectrum holder sharing in the auction proceeds in a proportion and amount to be negotiated between the FCC and the spectrum holder as a part of the spectrum surrender agreement. And that's the right approach. It needs to be entirely voluntary in terms of the willingness of the spectrum holder to surrender the spectrum. But I think you'll find a number of spectrum holders being willing to do that if the promise is sharing in the auction proceeds once that spectrum is put to public auction. Legislation is needed in order to enable that to happen, because at the present time, the FCC, in the minds of virtually everyone, lacks incentive auction authority. And so I think you can expect to see this measure be a priority this year. I want to just stress a couple of aspects of this bill that I think you'll see the debate focus on. If you're following the issue, you've already noticed that the broadcasters are hypersensitive about this entire subject matter. In the early discussions about the identification of new spectrum and taking spectrum from private spectrum holders, there was speculation that the surrender of the spectrum might not be entirely voluntary. And the subject always was, is there broadcast spectrum available that could be utilized for this purpose? And the broadcasters probably hold the spectrum that would be the majority of the spectrum surrendered even under voluntary means for incentive auctions. Broadcasters manned the battlefronts during the course of the last 2 years, made it very clear that they would fight in order to maintain their spectrum if there was any effort to obtain it involuntarily. And an announcement was made at the Federal Communications Commission that any spectrum to be surrendered would entirely be on a voluntary basis. Nothing would be put to auction that was not voluntarily offered. And in our legislation that we put forward on a bipartisan basis last year, we had that same provision, that under no circumstances could spectrum be involuntarily obtained from private spectrum holders. So I think it's very clear that the surrender will be entirely on a voluntary basis, but you will continue to see all parties concerned reemphasize that, just to offer assurance across the board. The debate may focus more on what we call repacking. And repacking means that if you have a number of spectrum holders who voluntarily surrender their spectrum, and that spectrum is then vacated and auctioned, you may have what looks a little bit like a checkerboard of spectrum. You'll have areas that have been vacated and could be used for commercial wireless services, but interspersed within those will be other spectrum that is continually occupied by the private user. So you've got a broadcaster vacating here, a broadcaster using the spectrum here, a broadcaster vacating here, and so forth. And for the most efficient use of that spectrum for commercial wireless services, it would need to be contiguous. So you would need to, in effect, move some broadcasters from their existing channel into another channel location in order to have fully contiguous spectrum available for optimum use. We call that repacking. And the broadcasters, as you can imagine, are quite concerned about that. And we're kind of emerging now into the same kind of debate about repacking that we had about the original notion of spectrum surrender. Is it going to be voluntary or not? And would the broadcasters be compensated for any costs that are associated with channel relocation? And those costs